Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast from the Conference Board, Rebooting a Crashed Global Economy, Charting the Recovery. I'm David Hoffman. I lead the Conference Board in Asia. I'm calling in today from circuit breaker stay-at-home mode in Singapore. On the line today with me are my colleagues who are based in the United States in New York. Eric Lund, a senior economist in our global economics team, and Bart Van Ark, our chief economist. Today, we'll be speaking about the United States and European economies and the global economic situation. This is the first in a series or part of a series where we're trying to basically peel the onion on the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on economies everywhere. This is not an Asia-specific presentation today, but it's very important for Asia. Asia and China depend significantly on export demand from the U.S. and Europe, so it's imperative we understand what's going on in these major economies if we're to understand the likely economic impacts we're going to feel here. Again, we will have other programs around China specifically and other related topics that are very local in nature, but this is an incredibly important piece. Just to reiterate the introductory instructions, please type any questions you may have in the dialog box on your lower left corner. I will pick those up and feed those into the presenters as we go, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can today. So without further ado, let's get started. Bart, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure to join here in the evening hours in the United States. I thought we would set the tone today by basically very briefly say where we are in the pandemic. It's important that we follow this on a continuous basis because when we talk about the economy and what sort of might happen next, the fundamental assumptions really are what do we expect or what is actually happening in front of us. So we follow this very closely. We personally find Bloomberg, who's basing itself on data from other places, very good, a particular story for the Johns Hopkins University. And this slide is showing us sort of the most important insights just of today. This was downloaded this afternoon. The bad news, of course, is here that we have passed, unfortunately, the 2 million registered cases around the world for COVID-19. This is registered. I'd say that with an emphasis because it's very likely, as we all know, that there are many more cases than what is being registered as such. We also passed the 125,000 mark of registered deaths related to COVID-19. These obviously are horrible numbers. We're not to the end of it. But the good news in this slide is that you begin to see in most countries around the world now that are most hit by the crisis so far, that you see a leveling off of the number of new cases being added. The U.S. is now being the largest country, also having most of the cases, but also Spain and Italy, the UK, all of them are beginning to see leveling off on what is essentially an exponential scale. So the fact that the data moving sideways is very important in this respect. Also, when we look country by country, you see that everywhere the number of additional cases is beginning to decline. And again, that means that we're probably past at least the major first peak of this crisis. We're not through this, of course, in addition to the fact that we need to continue to be aware of possible new resurgence of COVID cases, and we'll come back to that during the conversation. We're also very closely looking at what is happening in the developing world and in the emerging markets, where we just beginning to see the beginnings of new cases. Of course, in Brazil, we'll see quite a lot of this. Also in some other Latin American countries, we have seen some really horrible pictures from India, and some of you may be calling in from India. That doesn't look very promising. And also in sub-Saharan Africa, we're beginning to see some hotspots. Now, there are different arguments here. One argument is that these are tropical countries, so maybe the virus is not as intense as it is in colder areas. That's not been proven at all. But it might be the case, of course. There are younger populations. They tend to be somewhat less vulnerable, or at least get less sick from the virus. But at the other end, of course, what we do know is that the healthcare systems in all these countries are significantly weaker, and that any kind of escalation of cases could have disastrous human consequences. So there's still a lot to go in terms of what might happen to this virus, and it's certainly not behind us. Turning this a little bit now to the economy, a good transition here is to think about what governments have done in order to try to reduce the impact of this crisis. And that is, of course, particularly by introducing fairly stringent measures in terms of social or physical distancing, as it is called these days. These are ranging from recommendations to stay at home to complete lockdowns. And in this chart, you see a combination of measures. This is work done by the University of Oxford that basically looked at a wide range of countries, tried to identify what are the measures taken in terms of business closures, school closures, travel restrictions, other measures that are being taken in order to promote social distancing, and so on and so forth. And you see that this, of course, has been ramping up over the past couple of weeks. But in the last week or two, we're beginning to see somewhat of a sideways movement. The index is very high. It's at 80 on a scale of 100. And the leveling off at this moment is primarily related to China and to a few of the other Asian economies. But now in the last few days, of course, we have seen some opening up happening in, for example, Austria, in Denmark, where since today schools have been reopened, at least very, very slowly. So there's probably some leveling off, but the way up on this index is going to be has been much faster than actually the reduction and the way down for this index. So,
hey, Bart, I had a quick question for you,
please.
actually. We heard about a resurgence in the number of cases in places like Singapore and other Japan as well. How much of that do you think is a function of kind of coming down too quickly on this chart and letting the virus get out of hand once again?
Well, maybe if you don't mind, I pass that question on to David, because David is in Singapore, and we do know that Singapore actually has seen a resurgence of cases and an introduction of stringency measures. So, David, maybe you want to take this question.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore never really relaxed measures. It just didn't tighten them down so completely as it has as of now. It seemed that the case count was under control for quite a long while, actually, until travel restrictions were put in place that caused a number of returnees to come back to Singapore before restrictions were imposed. And many places around the world experienced similar issues, including mainland China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and elsewhere. So, you know, the imported cases went up and some community infections spread from there. So, you know, the point I think to take away from all this is that this is here to stay with us for a while, even with tightened supervision. It takes time.
You're breaking up a little bit at the moment. So
Demonstrable control.
Sorry, you were breaking up a little bit in your last comment, but I think that the main messages are being taken, that certainly this issue hasn't gone away. The way to look at these kind of viruses, as the medical experts would say, is that you know, the virus doesn't go away. There's always a risk of coming back. What you really want to do is to lower the peak as much as possible, and social distancing helps in order to make sure that the next peak is not going to be as high, and the more we can reduce it, in addition to things like medication or perhaps down the road a vaccine, can help enormously to try to kill the virus and avoid it to stay too long with us. Let me move on to some of the early signals. I mean, we're now sort of getting some really hard data in that will help us a little bit to understand how bad this crisis is impacting on the global economy. And after that, I will hand off to Eric to talk a little bit about the scenario type of analysis that we have adopted to begin to understand what this might mean for the economy in going forward. Now, of course, in first instance, you always look at financial markets because they give us sort of real-time signals of what the sentiment is. We've been doing that right from the beginning of this crisis. The black line here is basically tracking the S&P 500 since mid-February and has been comparing it with other crises as they have been happening over the past 2 decades or so. What you see is that basically for the first sort of 25, 30 days into the crisis, the S&P index was surprisingly closely tracking the Lehman Brothers collapse that we saw back in 2008. And that has been going on until about 20, 25 days. Then we see slightly different movements. The first uptick in the S&P 500 was really related to the announcement of the CARES Act in the United States. So it's the REEF 2.3 trillion, the REEF plan that was announced about 2 weeks ago. Then the index started to move sideways. And then last week we saw it moving up again further. And that was really related to the fact that we were beginning to see that leveling off that I referred to earlier. In the past few days, again, the index has been moving sideways. Today has not been added here, but again, we had a bit of a decline today. And that is because markets are beginning to prepare for some really new numbers that are going to come in. In addition, one important number that we're going to get in tomorrow is, again, unemployment claims. We already had a few unemployment claims in the United States that have been adding up to about 10 million. That will expect more coming in tomorrow. And the markets are just bracing for more bad news. We also had retail data in today, which were terrible, and various other indexes that are now pointing in the direction of how tough this crisis is really is right now. In this chart, you're looking at the S&P 500 again, which is the red line. Sorry, I have to move that on. This chart, the S&P 500 is the red line here. Here you can see that the S&P 500 has actually recovered to about 40% from where it started to decline. I don't think this is a signal that this will go all the way back, although eventually it may. But as I said earlier, it's more likely that it is going to be volatile and moving sideways for quite a while to come. What is striking is the blue line, which is the oil price. And the oil price, of course, had basically a double hit. It was impacted by the slowdown in global demand, which has had a major impact on the demand for oil. But in addition to that, there has been a major supply shock because it has taken quite a while for some of the main players, particularly Saudi Arabia and Russia, to reach agreement on production cuts. That has now happened. That is finally being put in process. But it has really added very little to the recovery in the price, as you can see. And that is because the dominant picture of the drop in the global economy is really predominant here. This chart is looking at the U.S. This is more U.S. focused here. Here we're looking at both CEO confidence, which is the orange line, but I'd like to talk specifically here about the blue line, which is the expectations of consumers. This is our consumer index for the United States, consumer confidence. And the line here is referring to the expectations that consumers have with regard to job conditions, their income situation, and business conditions. And what you can see here is that the line actually has come down quite sharply. Just in 1 month time, in March, it came down by 20 points on the expectations index. Now, when you look at this chart, you might say, well, that doesn't look so bad, because when we look at the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, it went all the way down to less than 30. The point is that that took about 14, 15 months before we got from the highest level before the crisis to that very low level. Here, in 1 month, we lost 20 points. We can almost certainly expect a further decline going to happen very rapidly in the next 2 or 3 months. So this is a very rapid decline, and that makes this crisis so hard to deal with. The shock has been very, very large. We also saw in March numbers coming in on jobs. We lost 700,000 jobs, and this was only mid-March. So this was just up to the point that the WHO called COVID-19 a global pandemic. Already at that time, we were losing so many jobs in the United States, and strikingly, about more than 400,000 of those were just in one sector, which were food services and drinking places. But gradually, as the crisis continues, you'll see more a wider spread of these job cuts across many occupations. Today, we also released job ads, so this is vacancies, and again, this is a little bit of a very refined chart, but we try to sort of identify where the biggest declines in terms of jobs ads were taking place. And again, you see them in places like, everything in terms of food services, lodging and travel, passenger transport, even in health and education, we see quite a few declines. despite the demand on the healthcare sector, major portions of healthcare, actually the demand has completely disappeared, or there's no supply because all the resources have been reallocated to the treatment of COVID. There are a few areas, only a few, where you still see a pickup in vacancies. That includes things like pharmacists or emergency medical people. So there are some areas where we see some increases, but on the whole, again, the decline in vacancies is very, very sharp. I want to wrap up this section and then hand off to Eric by talking about CEO confidence. So we talked about consumer confidence. In addition to that, we track CEO confidence. And CEO confidence also has come down quite sharply, but there are some interesting pieces in that index. We're basically looking here at sort of three observations. The blue ones at the top are the observations for the confidence of CEOs in the last quarter of 2019. And then in the middle row, we again surveyed CEOs in the first quarter. This was between mid-February and mid-March. You then see that the index already came down quite a bit, from 43 to 36. By the way, what this means is that any kind of measure below 50 means that there are more negative CEOs than optimistic CEOs. So all these numbers on this whole chart all are below 50, but it has declined further. But we decided to actually survey the CEOs one more time because of the rapid evolution of events. And what we then saw, this was kind of late March, early April, that's the bottom row here, we saw a slight further decline in CEO confidence. But if you move to the right here, you can see that almost all of that decline was concentrated in the assessment of CEOs on current conditions. What does the economy look like at this point in time, in the economy as a whole, as well as your own industry? And there you see that the numbers are now have gone down to 3 or 11. It really can't go lower than this. It's just very, very, very weak confidence. However, when you look at expectations, the forward-looking perspective of CEOs, it actually improved a little. But that is perhaps not so surprising, because if you are so rock bottom in terms of your assessment of current conditions, then of course it only gets better. And that is an important issue for Eric to discuss in a little bit more detail in a minute when we talk about the various scenarios, because this almost points a little bit as if CEOs expect that the recovery might be somewhat V-shaped, that it might be a sharp recovery coming after the very rapid decline, which is one of the scenarios that we will be showing.
Yeah, Bart, just on that a second, these are U.S. CEOs, but of major global multinationals, right? And I think there were some implications for Asia in this a little bit, right?
Absolutely, because what we do ask, you are right. First of all, the respondents to this index are CEOs of multinational companies. In addition to asking them about conditions in the US, we ask them about conditions in Europe, conditions in China, and other parts of the world. And we do see that their assessment of China and even Europe is slightly better than in the United States. But that is probably related to where the emphasis of COVID-19 was. And as it has gradually shifted from Asia to Europe to the United States, it's understandable that I think slightly more positive, or slightly less negative, I should perhaps say, about conditions in the rest of the world. Just to wrap up, and then I'm handing off to Eric. Yesterday, the International Monetary Fund produced their first outlook for the global economy. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. That was a very dark scenario. As you can see here in the blue line, the projections of the IMF for 2020 are that the global economy will decline by about 3%. That's an unprecedented decline. The global economy only declined by about 0.5% back in 2008. And this is really not something that we have seen since the Depression in the 1930s. Advanced economies decline as much as 6%, and the emerging markets decline just about 1%. You see that the IMF is fairly optimistic in a way about what might happen by the end of this year, and see a somewhat stronger recovery in 2021, particularly in emerging markets. Now, we need to discuss it in a little bit more detail, and we have a few more slides on that IMF forecast. We have some question marks around this. But I think for that, we probably first need to go to the scenarios. But David, let me stop here, see if you have any questions. People are encouraged to put also questions in the chat box. Or Eric, if you have any questions at this point in time.
Yeah, I don't think we have any. We don't have any questions yet from the audience, but I think just to emphasize the part just Bart just made about this expectation for decline in the global economy of 3% versus 0.5% in the 2008 global financial crisis. That is the magnitude of the issue we are facing here in Asia.
Because the reason is that we really didn't shut down the economy in the way that it has happened now. I mean, in the 2008-09 crisis, it was a terrible crisis, but it was a crisis that sort of gradually evolved and took actually quite a long time to recover. And there's one question now in the chat box about whether you think the IMF scenario is too negative. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but let me just give it away a little bit. I personally think that the scenarios are too negative on the advanced economies, but too optimistic on the emerging markets. But we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that later. Eric, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much, Bart and David, for the intro and the great insights so far. I'm going to walk the audience through some of the work we've been doing in terms of forecasting the impact of all of this on the U.S. economy, on the European economy, and on the Chinese economy. There are so many moving parts. There's so much volatility and ambiguity that we're facing that it's extremely difficult for us to come up with the standard forecasts that we're accustomed to. And so for that reason, what we've decided to do at the conference board is to come up with a variety of scenarios. We look at, of course, as Bart touched on earlier on, we track the daily number of cases in a variety of countries and regions around the world to try to get a sense of how things are developing. Of course, we're paying attention to government policy, to the effectiveness of social distancing campaigns. And so we use all those data to generate these possible directions in which we could possibly move. And so for the U.S., we actually have 4 specific scenarios that we have developed thus far. The first one we call the May reboot, which is a quick recovery scenario. This scenario assumes that the peak number of new COVID-19 cases for the U.S. as a whole peak out in mid-April. And that we begin to see economic activity gradually resume sometime in May. The second scenario we call the summertime V, or the deep contraction, or the V-shaped recovery. We have a couple different names for it. This assumes that we hit a peak number of COVID-19 cases probably around early May or so. That having been said, the economic contraction is quite severe in Q2, but we also see a relatively strong bounce back in the third quarter. But there's a high degree of uncertainty here about how quickly we could actually open the economy in this scenario. The third scenario we call the fall COVID-19 resurgence. In this scenario, we assume sort of a summertime shape, at least in the first half of the year or so. But then we see a resurgence in the virus in the fall, which requires another lockdown of some degree and another economic hit. And then finally, we have the fall recovery scenario, which is a scenario that's based on the policy work that's been done in the U.S. to really try to flatten the curve, which seems to have been effective, at least over the last week or so, given the data that we've been seeing. This reduces the number of peak cases that we get at any given time so that they don't overload the U.S. Medical system, but it extends the weakness out over the course of the entire year. So you don't really have the kind of sharp V-shaped recovery that we see in the summertime rebound. So it's one thing to try to explain all this to you just by speaking, but we actually have some visual aids as well. So here are the 4 scenarios. We've created a new model, a new economic model, to try to understand how this story is going to play out. So we're actually gauging economic output for the U.S. and for some other economies as well on a month-to-month basis. Because the virus is evolving at such a high frequency, we think that just to look at things on a quarterly basis really doesn't capture the full story. And so you'll see here, this is for 2020. This is indexed to 100 in the third quarter of last year. And you can see the shape of the way the economy sort of evolves. The quick recovery is the blue line, which comes down in April and then starts to pick up. We are seeing the number of cases, as I mentioned, start to moderate in the U.S., but I think there's a lot of concern about the ability of the U.S. to actually open up and lift these social distancing policies in a rapid kind of a way. There's a lot of pushback and concern about that because of possible escalation in infections that would follow. We then have the summer V, which you can see is a little deeper, but comes back up. And the U, which is a much sort of more gradual gray line, that's the flattening of the curve scenario that I touched on earlier on. So one of the important things I think and then of course the W-shaped fall resurgence, which is that yellow line that then goes back down into red towards the end of the year. All four of these scenarios leave the U.S. economy in a situation where at the end of the year, we have still not the economy has not caught up with where it was prior to the crisis. So none of these lines are above the 102 or so entry point that we see for January. So regardless of what path we take, we're going to be in a worse situation in the U.S. By the end of the year than we were at the beginning. Also, as you can see, some of these scenarios have much deeper annual contractions than others. You can see that the best case scenario, which is that, again, that quick recovery, results in a 3.6% contraction in U.S. economic growth for the year. The worst case scenario, which is that fall COVID resurgence, the V-shaped recovery, you see about a 7.4% contraction for the year.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Eric. I mean, we often get the question about what is the most probable. You know, we hate uncertainty, and one of the questions we quite often get is, conference board, it's fine that you give us these scenarios, but which one should we go for? What's your answer to that?
If I was forced to choose one, I think at this point, the gray fall recovery, U-shaped recovery, is probably the most probable. But I really would impress on business planners and people in the C-suite not to fixate on any single pathway at this point. It's too early to commit. I know that there is there's a intention and a desire to be able to plan around a single scenario, but being nimble and being agile as things develop, we could find that we are trending on the U shape and then we suddenly have a bigger dip or a resurgence. And so really contemplating and thinking about all four of these scenarios, I think, is important, even though maybe one is a little more probable than the others.
I would perhaps add to that. First of all, I think the blue one, the quick recovery scenario, is pretty much out of the window for the U.S., but even for the Asian economies, which are a little bit further down the line, I don't think that we see anywhere really something that we would call quick recovery. So I think the focus is really now on the V versus the U at this point in time. The V is in a way attractive because, what comes down will go up again, and if we can sort of get things going again, that would be sooner rather than later, that would reduce the sort of continuation of contraction over a longer period of time. But as you said earlier, the V is a highly uncertain scenario because if we recover too fast, the risk of actually having to pull back at a later point in time because you get, the peak of new cases is going to pick up again is just too big, so too large. So the risk is really, the V is a highly uncertain scenario. So I think from a business planning perspective, in a way, the U, which feels painful because it takes significantly longer, is a much more controllable scenario. It gives you more time to prepare about how do we get out of this and how do we prepare ourselves for what is called a 1.5 meter economy these days, or in the US, a 6 foot economy, right? So how do you do this? And we probably need a bit more time. And what's interesting about these scenarios, by the end of the year, it really doesn't matter all that much, right? Whether you end up with 6.5 or 6.6 or even 7, at the end of the year, you're probably in pretty much the same boat. So you might as well choose for a bit of certainty rather than for the huge uncertainty that the V-shape is giving you.
Yeah, Bart, to your statement just now about what goes down goes up again, I mean, is that an unarguable idea? I mean, it looks to me like we knocked $4 or $5 trillion out of the economy that could be quite permanent. Is that, am I getting this wrong?
No, not entirely. There is another letter. We played with the U, the V, and the W. There's another letter. It's called L. And L basically means that you get a sideways movement, right? All these lines do not pick up again. That is very unlikely to happen in the midst of a very rapid decline. So I think there's an economic law that basically says if you basically stop the economy, people need to live on something. So it will pick up. The question is the speed by which this will pick up. However, once we go into 2021, and of course the new year is not a sharp line here, I mean this could happen a little earlier or a little later, the question is what does this really mean for the medium-term development? And that leads to interesting questions about, you know, have we been burned so much that we have no money to invest in new growth? Or an alternative option is that maybe so many weak companies have gone bust and bankrupt and have disappeared that the companies that are left over are actually going to grow significantly faster. So for example, there's a lot of discussion about the productivity gain that you can get after a crisis like this because the least productive companies, unfortunately, but in the long run, good for the economy, will disappear and create room for the better companies to grow. I think that's very uncertain, too early to say, but I think an L in 2020 is unlikely. In 2021, I think we should look at that.
Oh, thanks, Bart. That's excellent comments. I wanted to move on and touch just very briefly on what we see to be sort of how this crisis is unfolding. And this isn't unique to the U.S. We see this as taking place in other parts of the world as well. The crisis has really started off as a supply side sort of a shock. It's programs like social distancing are impacting the ability of businesses to operate. And then, of course, over time, it evolves from that supply side shock where businesses are eventually able to reopen, as they are in places like China and other parts of Asia, which are a little bit further ahead on the timeline than we are in the US or in Europe. But the damage that's done to the workforce, the damage that's done to incomes and things like that, eventually create a new difficulty, and that's sort of the demand side shock. And I think that's something that we're going to be seeing in China, especially in other parts of Asia, that have emerged from the worst of the virus, are starting to reopen. It's going to be challenging to get consumers to get back into the stores. Some of them are taking income hits. Certainly, there's been confidence hits, and then of course there's export markets as well. So while China's economy certainly isn't as exposed to foreign demand or exports as it was 15 or 20 years ago in terms of the share of GDP. Certainly it's still important, and certainly the demand from places like Europe and the US is not necessarily going to be there. So it's going to be a challenge for economies with that kind of export exposure as well. So it's sort of a 1-2 punch, I guess, is the quicker way of trying to explain it. On the left side is the supply, followed by a hit on the right side on the demand side.
Yeah, and I think later on we'll talk a little bit more about, there's a question also there about which market sectors will we cover completely and which won't. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with, how do we reopen the economy again? And that's a question we will address towards the end of this webcast, because that, the way by which we're reopening the economy can have major implications for what it means for individual sectors.
Mm-hmm. Just one other quick comment on the U.S., and I think this, again, it applies to other economies as well. The bigger hit that we're seeing, I think, is on the consumption side of the equation, especially in the midst of the first half of the year. But we should see a relatively strong rebound in consumer spending later in the year. On the other side of this, of course, you have real capital spending, business investment. We're not forecasting as big a hit on real capital spending, but we're also not forecasting as big of a jump either. So there's a bit of I think, an asymmetry here. This is more of a consumer sort of damage story for the U.S. than it is a business investment story.
David, there's a really good question there. Well, there are a lot of good questions, but I think one that we should specifically also address at this point, and that is sort of pent-up demand. The question is about, we start seeing numbers like 3.2 million spending in one day within luxury retail when QZ opened up again. What are the projections for China, and how will that impact the global economy? So one, it goes back to your earlier question, David, about, why do things pick up after things come down? That's because there's pent-up demand. So it basically means that people postpone purchases and buy later. And the luxury retail example you give is a good example here because indeed those are postponed purchasing intentions that people have, and they will buy it later. The problem is, to Eric's point, a large part of this crisis is a consumer crisis, and it's highly concentrated in services. Services don't have much pent-up demand. Right? Simply, if you can't take your meal in March, it doesn't mean that if you go back to the restaurant in June, you'll say, well, why don't we just take 2 meals per person instead of 1? So you don't have that kind of pent-up demand that strongly, and that is one of the reasons that the V cannot be that sharp and is much more likely a U. So it really depends on, durable consumer goods really have a lot of this pent-up, but non-durable consumer goods, and particularly service, don't really have a lot of that.
Yeah, and to this point, I mean, again, this webcast today is about the U.S. and Europe and the global economy and that hit that we're likely to take in China and Asia from export demand and so forth. But in China, what we're most worried about are the unemployment effects of this crisis that happened in the Jan-February timeframe and that continue to this day. As wages are cut or people are furloughed or as people are laid off, this depresses household income growth in aggregate, and that impacts spending overall. So on the high end of the Chinese market, there's a lot of resilience. There are, anywhere from 150 to 200 million quite wealthy or, hugely wealthy people, and their spending power is still there. But in the very large mass market that is China, that sector has taken a very big hit. So we may see category spending up in luxury or so on and so forth, but overall spending way down because of the household income impact. Household income is the most important thing for us to be watching in China.
And that's the demand side that Eric was talking about earlier. This is the movement.
Exactly.
Yeah, the movement
it's the same in the U.S.
to a demand side problem.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, 70% of the U.S. economy is derived from consumption. So, consumer confidence is highly correlated in the U.S. With wages and income. So a loss of a job, a loss of wages translates to much lower confidence, much lower spending, and a much slower U.S. economy. But let's move on. We've talked about the U.S. economy enough. Let's touch briefly on Europe. So we've been running a similar scenario-based approach to the European Union. We haven't finalized these numbers quite yet. These are preliminary, but as you can see, a lot of the shape is quite similar to the shapes that we went over with the U.S. There are a few things to note here. As was the case with the U.S., the overall size of the Euro economy is going to be smaller at the end of 2020 than it was at the beginning. But there are a few other sort of interesting differences as well. The degree of social welfare systems in the U.S. isn't nearly as robust as it is in Europe. And for that reason, there are sort of these automatic triggers that kind of come into play in terms of helping people who have lost their jobs in Europe continue to pay their rent and feed themselves and things like that. And that should, there are movements in the U.S. Vis-a-vis some programs to try to get money directly to citizens, but that's taking some time and there's some complications. While it's very automated in Europe, and so for that reason, we may see softer edges in some ways in the EU than we do in the U.S. with respect to how sharp a decline and how long a decline we see there. As Bart mentioned earlier on, the IMF released a report today that showed a 3% contraction in overall global GDP growth, a very somber outlook for sure. There's one thing to point out here that according to the IMF forecast, it'll take until 2021 for the global economy to get back to where it was in 2019. So they're really forecasting not just a deep contraction, but a global recession that takes quite a while to get out of. We don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. We think that we may see it won't take quite as long for the global economy to get back to where it was prior to this, as the IMF thinks is the case. I know Bart had some pretty strong views on this earlier on. Bart, did you want to weigh in on your overall take on what they were thinking in this report today?
Before I respond to that, what is interesting here is that the euro area projections are significantly weaker than for the US, whereas in our current scenarios, the difference between the US and Europe aren't all that large. And just what you mentioned earlier, Eric, about these automated stabilizers and the use of short-time working programs in Europe, that you would expect that it would actually provide a little bit of a cushion to the economy. Well, it does to employment, but it doesn't do it to GDP. And we've seen the same thing in 2008 or 9, that the short-time working programs didn't help employment and keep people on the payroll, but output still collapsed. What it does, however, is that once you come out of the crisis, it becomes much easier for companies to start up again. So Germany was a really good example of that, and Germany is using the same instruments again this time, that, coming out of the crisis, they still have those people on the payroll, and therefore they can start up much more easily, whereas in the case of the US, we've laid off people, we stopped processes and everything else, and it takes much more time to get going again. So that's I think, what's interesting here. I mean, to your other point, maybe I can better answer that with the next slide, Eric, because I think what this slide really does is the blue line here shows, it's comparable to the scenarios you showed earlier. It shows the blue line, the decline in the advanced economies, and then you see that the improvement goes all the way until the end of 2021. So it basically means that not just this year, but also next year, we will need in order to get the economy back to where it was in 2019, which is the benchmark year. That's a very long period of time, and your scenarios that you described a little earlier suggest that actually that recovery will have been done more or less by the end of the year of 2020, and then in 2021 we may begin to see some recovery. So that's the reason why I believe it's much more negative in the IMF scenario.
I mean, and especially if you look at the emerging markets forecast here, you have a really rapid recovery. Essentially, we're back to the 100 point by second quarter of 2020 as where we were in 1Q 2019. While this doesn't happen for 18 months later for advanced economies. And I think that's maybe seeing things a little bit through rose-colored glasses for developing
what I worry about is that
the
IMF hasn't taken into account where we started this webcast, and I commented that I think in emerging markets we haven't seen the full impact of COVID-19 yet. So I think we're just not taking into account that emerging markets really may still be entering a very difficult period. In addition to that, they're very much tied in with the advanced economies. They're a major source. The Western economies, the advanced economies, are a major source of demand for those economies. So I also find the red line too optimistic and the blue line too pessimistic.
Well, we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to move forward, I wanted to just briefly touch on China and what we're thinking with respect to how China's economy is handling all this. In general, we expect a much more significant impact than, of course, the SARS crisis. For a couple of different reasons. The virus was much a wider spread, much more disruptive. The services sector in China is much larger now than it was in 2003. Services, as we've already mentioned, is the sector that is most disrupted by social distancing. Ergo, the social distancing that was implemented during this crisis impacts a larger slice of the economy. And then, of course, there is the fact that this wasn't just a China-centric or at least East Asia-centric pandemic. It really affected the outside world. And of course, that has implications when a lot of your customers are outside of China. So anemic demand from Europe, anemic demand from the United States results in again, hitting China's especially industrial sector vis-a-vis a lapse in demand. One other thing that I think is interesting to note is the government stimulus side of things. Following the financial crisis, for instance, the Chinese government was able to pour massive amounts of stimulus into the economy. And in doing so, they really fended off a lot of the pain that was witnessed in other economies around the world. That having been said, there was that amount of stimulus led to some problems that China has been grappling with ever since, in terms of excess capacity, in terms of non-performing loans, these sorts of issues. And there's I think a certain kind of reticence to pour on debt in the same way that was done over a decade ago today. Also, the overall size of the China's economy has gotten a lot bigger over the last 12 or 13 years. So even if China were to pour in the same amount of stimulus in terms of RMB, it wouldn't go as far because it's diluted, because the base, China's economy, is that much larger. And so for all of these reasons, we think that this is going to be a much more severe issue inside of China than SARS was, or even the financial crisis was.
Yes.
David, did you want to mention anything?
In there on this point 4, most people think of China as having unlimited funding capacity, and we think that that assumption is wrong. China has a lot of funding capacity, but it's not unlimited. And one very important thing to realize is that going into this crisis, China was on a downward trajectory. A natural downward trajectory that we have for a long time called the long soft fall in Chinese growth. That's very different from 2003, of course. And the Chinese government is under very high fiscal pressure with a slowing economy, a late stage real estate sector, and so on and so forth. We don't think that much can be expected from the government vis-a-vis stimulus. This said, China is very good at building infrastructure and doing it very quickly. If the U.S. today were to announce that as part of stimulus, we're going to undertake our infrastructure plan, it would take years just to agree on the projects and the spending and so on and so forth. China can get shovels digging immediately, and that creates GDP. To Eric's point, it may not be efficient GDP. It may entrain long-term productivity problems if the investment is inefficient, but it can move quickly in that regard. And so far, the government is talking about spending quite considerably on infrastructure to the tune of about 7 trillion RMB this year. So that will matter. But keep in mind that the funding is not unlimited.
Thanks, David. We're running a little close to the top of the hour, so I want to briefly touch on our forecast for growth over the next several quarters in China. Of course, the first quarter GDP numbers come out on Friday. So we'll see how close we were in terms of this first figure, but we're expecting about a 15% contraction for the year-on-year growth for China for the first quarter, and then a more of a gradual recovery over the course of the year. We're not expecting a big pop in Q2 or even really a big pop in Q3. As we mentioned earlier on, the biggest impact initially is on the supply side, but there's a demand side to this story that is only starting to emerge now. And so until Chinese consumers feel more confident, until Chinese export markets are through the worst of this, we're not going to see a really sharp recovery, at least in the second or third quarter. So if you add all of this together, Q1 through Q4, our expectations are pretty much a zero growth scenario for China for 2020. We have a few other slides here as well, but Bart has some really interesting insights and thoughts on how we reopen and reboot the economy. So I'm going to skip a couple of these slides to make sure that he has enough time to cover this, because I really think it's key.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Eric. And it also still leaves a couple of minutes for final questions at the end. The critical question, of course, is how do we basically start up an economy? This is unprecedented. We've never deliberately shut down an economy as we have done, not the entire economy, but very large sectors of the economy. And the real question now is how to begin to open this up again. There's a lot of debate around this around the world, certainly in the last couple of days or so, very, very intensely in the United States, and unfortunately, in some aspects, a little bit politicized, which is not good, because this is a really serious and important discussion to have. We think it's important to essentially make a distinction between two major parts when it comes to reopening the economy. The first part of it is related to sort of more the medical or epidemiological side, and that is how do we make sure that it is safe to go out of lockdown and shelter at home. The second is more focused on how do we actually then open a business in that kind of environment. Now, on the first point, of course, and again, there's a lot of lessons learned here from Asia, because obviously, first of all, Asia has more experience with these kind of crises, in contrast to Western Europe and the US, where we haven't really had a pandemic since 1918 with the Spanish flu. So we learn a lot from Asia. Physical distancing measures probably need to remain in place for significantly longer. Testing is very important, both in terms of testing for positive versus negative cases, but also antibody testing, which will help to decide, which people are at least more or less immune for the virus going forward. Provision of personal protective equipment. I know in Asia it's perfectly normal to wear masks in this kind of situation. In Western Europe and in Asia and in the US, as you know, it's much more uncommon. People don't even know how to use this in a responsible way and not actually make things worse. There's a whole debate about instantaneous contact tracing, again, something that is applied very strongly in the case of China. In some other Asian economies on a more voluntary basis, heavily debated in Europe at the moment, particularly in related to privacy issues. And then, of course, very, very importantly, is what kind of medical interventions or medical inventions can take place in terms of medication, in terms of vaccines. So that whole portfolio will be needed in order to see if it is at all safe to go out on the street and go back to work. Once that safety and that feeling of comfort is there that we can do this, the next question becomes how are we going to open up the economy? And in a way, this can be a discussion about which sectors do we open up first and which sectors do we open up later. In a way, it's also just a discussion about how well are businesses prepared to do this. If you're a business, you might begin to think about who do we really need to get back in the factory or on the work floor? Who are the people that perhaps can still continue to work from home because they're well set up to do everything virtually? In that way, we physically create more space for people who actually go out there because there are just fewer around. How can we gradually release travel restrictions, particularly in public transport in metro areas? This is important. What are airlines going to do in terms of start to fly again in a safe way? It's very important that we get some guidelines on that from government, but it's also very important that businesses themselves think in a sort of more self-regulatory way about how we can do this, and that interaction between government and business and trade associations is going to be very important. A lot of debate about the starting up of schools, and there are multiple sides to that debate. But one part of it to actually get schools opened up sooner rather than later is because of the concerns of educational quality by schooling from home, as well as the need for parents to go back to work, which is much more difficult if kids are still at home. And then finally, contract tracking needs to remain in place. Businesses need to continue to prepare themselves for a possible resurgence of the virus, hopefully in a less intense way than today, but still be able to more proactively respond compared to what has been happening in the middle of the crisis right now. So those are just some thoughts that we're having and that we derive from discussions that we're having with our members in order to see how we can contribute to this important discussion on getting this economy going again in a responsible way. So let me stop there, David. That might leave us just a few minutes for questions or from comments for your sides.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have time for any more questions, but I want to remind the group that, again, this was kind of framing the global economy situation. There will be more coming on the impacts of how global developments impact the region and China, and how China developments impact the region and the world. There's more to come, and there's a lot to unpack here. The scenario for recovery that Bart describes basically predicates on the notion that the virus is here to stay for a while. Some people will get it and recover, some won't, some will be immune, some will get it and never have any symptoms, and we will have to begin to resume work in a scenario where things are not fully resolved, in all likelihood, for a period of perhaps 12 to 18 months, or until a vaccine can be available to provide full assurance that there are no virus risks left. And what this means for business and for governments is that there's going to be a very delicate balance between employee and customer safety and business continuity and performance. It's a management challenge, it's a governance challenge, and it's ahead of us and it's confronting us. We're not quite sure what it means and what the best practices will be, but this is the area where we're really focused on unpacking next, and look forward to addressing you all again when we have more thinking, more analysis on these and other topics to share. So I think maybe if Bart or Eric, you have a few final comments, or should we wrap it up at the top of the hour?
Well, we will wrap it up at the top of the hour, which gives us 2 more minutes. I just want to pick up a couple of questions about financial markets and financial crisis at the end. And I do think it's important. I indicated earlier that actually we see the markets recovering a little bit, and it raises the question: how does the financial market relate to the real economy? We could spend a whole hour on that, to be honest. But I think the important message is don't take too much news from the financial markets in terms of what it really means for the real economy. The financial market is very good in incorporating news of the day very quickly and begin to look for the next thing down the road. And that's, I think, what we're really seeing in the financial market. So the fact that we still have an increase in number of deaths from COVID, that we have a huge increase in unemployment, is all sorts of stuff that the financial markets already kind of factor in their pricing. So that they already dealt with that. They're now looking at, is there more stimulus coming? And, how far can we push the central banks in terms of creating even more liquidity in the economy in order to move forward? So it's a different dynamic. It's not totally unrelated, of course, but it's a different dynamic from the real economy, and therefore has a different level of importance for businesses.
Thank you, Bart. On that note, we'll wrap up here. Thank you for attending. I want to remind you that in your dialog box in the middle of your screen, you can download today's presentation. So please feel free to do this. And we'd very much like your feedback. So if you wouldn't mind spending 30 seconds, or I think it's even less than that, to give us an evaluation, we will duly consider it. We always welcome feedback, especially on ways that we can improve sessions like these in the future. Thank you all for attending. Be safe. Best wishes for calm and well-being and stable business in this very difficult time. Thank you.